Hello, cow watchers. I have a special story for you. I used to spend a lot of time in Branson, Missouri with my grandparents, and one of the things that we would do is go see the Shepherd of the Hills play. And of course, that kind of led me to this novel. It's old and it has its problems, but even to this day, it is still a really good, beautiful piece of literature. And I hope it will be as special as it is to you as it is to me. So, here we go. Cows Audio presents The Shepherd of the Hills by Harold Bell Wright, as read by Looking for Cows. Chapter 1 The Stranger. It was corn planting time when the stranger followed the old trail into the Mutton Hall neighborhood. All day a fine rain had fallen steadily, and the mist hung heavy over the valley. The lower hills were wrapped in a winding sheet, dank and cold. The trees were dripping with moisture. The stranger looked tired and wet. By his dress, the man was from the world beyond the ridges, and his carefully tailored clothing looked strangely out of place in the mountain wilderness. Form stooped a little in the shoulders, perhaps with weariness, but he carried himself with the unconscious air of one long used to a position of conscious power and influence. And while his unkempt hair and beard were strongly touched with white, the brown, clear eyes that looked from under their shaggy brows told of an intellect unclouded by the shadows of many years. It was a face marked deeply by pride of birth, of intellect, of culture, the face of a scholar and a poet. But it was more. It was the countenance of one fairly staggering under the burden of disappointment and grief. As the stranger walked, he looked searchingly into the mist on every hand and paused frequently, as if questioning the proper course. Suddenly, he stepped quickly forward. His ear had caught the sharp ring of a horseshoe on the flint rock somewhere in the mist on the mountainside above. It was Jed Holland coming down the trail with a week's supply of cornmeal in a sack across his horse's back. As the figure of the traveler emerged from the mist, the native checked his horse to greet the newcomer with the customary salutations of the backwoods. "Howdy." The man returned Jed's greeting cordially, and resting his satchel on a rock beside the narrow path added, "I am very glad to meet you. I fear that I am lost." The voice was marvelously pure, deep, and musical, like the brown eyes betrayed the real strength of a man denied by his gray hair and bent form. The tones were as different from the high-keyed, slurring speech of the backwoods, and the gentleman himself was unlike any man Jed had ever met. The boy looked at the speaker in a wide-eyed wonder. He had a queer feeling that he was in the presence of a superior being. Throwing one thin leg over the old mare's neck and waving a long arm up the hill and to the left, Jed drawled, "That there's Dewey Ball. Down yonder's Mutton Hollow." Then turning a little to the right and pointing into the mist with the other hand, he continued, "Compton Ridge is over there. Where was you trying to get to, mister?" "Where am I trying to get to?" As the man repeated Jed's question, he drew his hand wearily across his brow. I, it doesn't matter much, boy. I suppose I must find some place where I can spend tonight. Do you live near here?" "Nope," Jed answered. "It's a right hard piece of where I live. That here's grinding all day and been to millin' over at Fall Creek, the Matthews mill head is. He'll plumb bark till I get home. I lowered you was a stranger in these parts. I catch sight of you. What might your name be, mister?" The other, looking back over the way he had come, seemed not to hear Jed's question. The native continued, "Mine's Holland. Pop and Marm, they come from Tennessee. Pap and Marm come from Tennessee. Pap, he's down in the back now, and ain't right pert, but he'll be around a little, I reckon. Preachin' Bill, he lowers it good for a fellow to be down in the back once in a while. Says if it weren't fur that we'd get to standin' so darn proud and ain't straight we'd go plumb over backwards." Very true indeed. he mused. Then he turned to Jed and asked, "Is there a house near here?" "Jim Lane lives up the trail, about a half-quarter. Ever heard of old Jim?" "No, I have never been in these mountains before." "I lowed maybe you'd heard of old Jim or Sammy. There's them lows Jim knows a heap more about old man's Dewey Cave than he lets on, his place being right so nigh. Reckon you know about Colonel Dewey, about them bald up there named fur? Maybe you come look for the big mine this is in the cave. I'll heap you hunt it if you want me to, mister." "No," said the other. "I am not looking for mines of lead or zinc. There is greater wealth in these hills and forests, young man." "Law, you don't say. Jim Wilson allers lowered that there might be gold in these here mountains, 'cause they're so dag-burn rough. Let me heap you, mister. I'd mighty like well to get some clothes like them." "I did not speak of gold, my boy," the stranger answered kindly. "But I must keep you no longer, or darkness will overtake us. Do you think that this Mr. Lane would entertain me?" Jed pushed a hand up over his tattered old hat and scratched a while before he answered. "Don't know about the entertaining, mister, but most anybody here would take you in." He turned and looked thoughtfully up the trail. "I don't guess that Jim's home tonight, though, 'cause I see Sammy a-fixin' to go over to Matthews when I came past. You know the Matthews, I reckon." There was a hint of impatience now in the deep voice. "No. I told you I had never been in these mountains before. Will Mr. Matthew keep me, do you think?" Jed, who was still looking up the trail, suddenly leaned forward and, pointing into the timber to the left of the path, said in an exciting whisper, "Look at that, mister. There by that yonder big rock." The stranger, looking, thought he saw a form, weird and ghost-like in the mist, flitting from tree to tree, but even as he looked, it vanished among the hundreds of fantastic shapes in the gray forest. "What is it?" he asked. The native shook his head. "Derned if I know, mister. You can't tell. There's a mighty strange stirrin' on this here mountain, and in the holler down yonder. Say, mister, did you ever see a haunt?" The gentleman did not understand. "A haunt, a ghost, some calls 'em," explained Jed. "Bud Wilson, he sure seed old Mats." The other interrupted. "Really, young man, I must go. It is already late, and you know I have yet to find a place to stay for the night." "La, that's all right, mister," replied Jed. "Ain't no call to worry. Stay anywhere. Where do you live when you're to home?" Again, Jed's question was ignored. "You think, then, that Mr. Matthew will keep me?" "La, yes. They'll take anybody in. I know they're to home 'cause they was a-fixin' to leave the mill when I left about a hour ago. Was the river up much when you come across?" As the native spoke, he was still peering uneasily into the woods. "I did not take the river. How far is it to this Matthews place, and how do I go?" "Just follow this old trail. It'll take you up there. Good road all the way. About 3 miles, I'd say. Did you come from Springfield or St. Louis, maybe?" The man lifted his satchel from the rock as he answered, "No, I do not live in either Springfield or St. Louis. Thank you very much for your assistance. I will go now, for I must hurry or night will overtake me, and I shall not be able to find the path." "Oh, it's a heap lighter when you get up on the hill above the fog," said Jed, throwing his leg from the horse's neck and settling the metal sack preparatory to moving. "But I'd a heap rather hit was you than me going up on Dewey's tonight." He was still looking up the trail. "Reckon you must be from Kansas City or Chicago? I heard tell they're mighty big towns." The stranger's only answer was a curt "goodbye" as his form vanished into the mist. Jed turned and dug his heels vigorously into the old mare's flanks as he ejaculated softly, "Well, I'll be done dern. Must be from New York, sure." Slowly, the man toiled up the mountain, up from the mist of the lower ground to the ridge above, and, as he climbed, unseen by him, a shadowy form flitted from the trees to tree in the dim, dripping forest. As the stranger came in the sight of the Lane cabin, a young woman on a brown pony rode out of the gate and up to the trail before him, and when the man reached the open ground on the mountain above and rounded the shoulder of the hill, he saw the pony, far ahead, lopping easily along the little path. A moment he watched, and the horse and rider passed from sight. The clouds were drifting far away. The western sky was clear with the sun still above the hills. In an old tree that leaned far out over the valley, a crow shook the wet from his plumage and dried himself in the warm light, while far below the mist rolled, and on the surface of that gray sea the travelers saw a company of buzzards wheeling and circling above some dead thing hidden in its depths. Wearily, the man followed the old trail towards the Matthews place, and always, as he went, in the edge of the gloomy forest fitted that shadowy form. Chapter 2. Sammy Lane. Preachin' Bill says, "It's a plumb shame there ain't more men in the world built like the old man Matthews and that poor boy and his. Men like them ought to be as common as the other kind, and would be, too, if folks cared as half as much about breeding folks as they do about raising hogs and horses. Mr. Matthews was a giant, fully 6 feet 4 inches in height, with big bones, broad shoulders, and mighty muscles. At log rollings and chopping bees in the fields or at the mill, or any of the games in which the backwoodsman tried his strength, no one had ever successfully contested his place as the strongest man in the hills. And still, throughout the countryside, the old folks tell with pride tales of the marvelous feats of strength performed in the old days when Old Matt was young. Of the son, Young Matt, the people called him, is enough to say that he seemed made of the same metal and cast in the same mold as the father. A mighty frame, softened but by young manhood's grace, a powerful neck and poised head with wavy red-brown hair, and blue eyes that had in them the calm of summer skies or the glint of battle steel. It was a countenance fearless and frank, but gentle and kind, and the eyes were honest eyes. Anyone meeting the pair, as they walked with the long, swinging stride of the mountaineer up the steep mill road that gray afternoon, would have turned for a second look. Such men are seldom seen. When they reached the big log house that looks down upon the hollow, the boy went at once with his axe to the woodpile, while the older man busied himself with the milking and other chores about the barn. Young Matt had not been chopping long when he heard, coming up the hill, the sound of horses' feet on the old trail. The horse stopped at the house, and a voice that stirred the blood in the young man's veins called, "Howdy, Aunt Molly." Mrs. Matthews appeared in the doorway. By her frank countenance and kind look, anyone would have known her at a glance as the boy's mother. "Land sakes, if that ain't Sammy Lane. How are you, honey?" "I'm all right," answered the voice. "I've come over to stop with you tonight. Dad's away. Mandy Ford stayed with me last night, but she had to go home this evening." The big fellow at the woodpile drove his axe deeper into the log. "It's about time you was a-comin' over," replied the woman in the doorway. "I was telling the men folks this morning that you had been nigh the whole blessed week. Mr. Matthews lowed maybe you was sick." The other returned with a gay laugh. "I was never sick a minute in my life that anybody ever heard tell. I'm powerfully hungry, though. You better put in another pan of cornbread." She turned her pony's head towards the barn. "Seems like you're always hungry," laughed the older woman in return. "Well, go on out to the barn, and the men will take your horse. Then come right in, and I'll mighty soon have something to fill you up." Operations at the woodpile suddenly ceased, and young Matt was first at the barnyard gate. Miss Sammy Lane was one of those rare young women whose appearance is not to be described. One can, of course, put it down that she was tall, beautifully tall, with the trimness of a young pine, deeply bosomed, with limbs full rounded, fairly tingling with the life and strength of perfect womanhood. And it may be said that her face was a face to go with one through the years, and to still live in one's dreams when the sap of life is gone, and withered and old. One sits shaking before the fire, a generous, loving mouth, red-lipped, full-arched, with the corners tucked in and perfect teeth between. A womanly chin and nose, with character enough to save them from being pretty, hair dark, showing a touch of gold with umber in the shadows, a brow full broad, set over brown eyes that never had been taught to hide behind their frigid veils, but always looked square out at you with a healthy look of good companionship, a gleam of mirth, or sudden, wide, questioning gaze that revealed the depth of soul within. But what is the use? When all this is written, those who knew Sammy will say, "'Tis a poor picture, for she is something more than all this." Uncle Ike, the postmaster at the Forks, did it much better when he said the preachin' bill the night of doin's at the Cove School. "By dundas, that gal old Jim's Lane just plumb fills the whole house. What? And when she comes riding up to the office on that brown pony burned, I'll be dad burn if she don't pretty nigh fill up the whole outdoors. Bad thunders, what?" And the little shriveled up old hillsman who keeps the ferry removed his cob pipe long enough to reply with all the emphasis possible to his squeaky voice. "She sure do, Ike, she sure do. I've often thought it didn't look jest fair for God Almighty to make such a girl without any man attached to her. It makes me feel plumb ashamed of myself to stand around in the same country with her. It sure do, Ike." Greeting the girl, the young man opened the gate for her to pass. "I've been looking for you over," said Sammy, a teasing light in her eyes. "Didn't you know that Mandy was stopping with me? She's been a-dying to see you." "I'm mighty sorry," he replied, fastening the gate and coming to the pony's side. "Why didn't you tell me before? I reckon she'll get over it all right, though," he added with a smile as he raised his arms to assist the girl to dismount. The teasing light vanished as the young woman placed her hands on the powerful shoulders of the giant, and as she felt the play of the swelling muscles that swung her up to the ground so easily, her face flushed with admiration. For the fraction of a minute she stood facing him, her hands still on his arms, her lips parted as if to speak. She then turned quickly away, and without a word walked towards the house, while the boy, pretending to busy himself with the pony's bridle, watched her as she went. When the girl was gone, the big fellow led the horse away to the stable, where he crossed his arms upon the saddle and hid his face from the light. Mr. Matthews, coming quietly to the door a few minutes later, saw the boy standing there, and the rugged face of the big mountaineer softened at the sight. Quietly he withdrew to the other side of the barn, to return later when the saddle and bridle had been removed, and the young man stood stroking the pony as the little horse munched on his generous feed of corn. The elder man lay his hand on the broad shoulder of the lad so like him, and looked so full into the clear eyes. "Is it all right, son?" he asked gruffly, and the boy answered as he returned his father's look, "It's all right, Dad." "Then let's get to the house. Mother called supper some time ago." Just as the little company were seated themselves at the table, the dog in the yard barked loudly. Young Matt went to the door. The stranger, whom Jed had met on the old trail, stood at the gate. Chapter 3. The Voice from Out of the Mist. While young Matt was gone to the corral in the valley to see that the sheep were safely folded for the night, and the two women were busy in the house with their after-supper work, Mr. Matthews and his guest sat on the front porch. "My name is Howitt, Daniel Howitt," the man said in answer of the host's question. But as he spoke, there was in his manner a touch of embarrassment, and he continued quickly as if to prevent further question. "You have two remarkable children, sir. That boy is the finest specimen of manhood I have ever seen, and the girl is remarkable, remarkable, sir. You will pardon me, I am sure. I am an enthusiastic lover of my kind, and I certainly have never seen such a pair." The grim face of the elder Matthew showed both pleasure and amusement. "You're not mistaken, mister. The boy's mine, all right. And he's still all that you say, and more, I reckon. I doubt if there's a man in the hills that can match him today. Not exceeding Josh Gibbs, and he's a mighty good boy, too. But the girl is the daughter of a neighbor, and no can at all." "Indeed," exclaimed the other. "You have only one child, then?" The amused smile left the face of the old mountaineer as he answered slowly. "There was 6 boys, sir. This one, Grant is the youngest. The others lie over there." He pointed with his pipe to where a clump of pines, not far from the house, showed dark and tall against the last red glow in the sky. The stranger glanced at the big man's face in a quick sympathy. "I only had two, a boy and a girl," he said softly. "The girl and her mother have been gone these 20 years. The boy grew to be a man, and now he has left me." The deep voice faltered. "Pardon me, sir, for speaking of this, but my lad was so like your boy there. He was all I had, and now, I am very lonely, sir." There is a bond of fellowship and sorrow that knows no conventionalities. As the two men sat in the hush of the coming night, their faces turned towards the somber group of trees. They felt strongly drawn to one another. The mountaineer's companion spoke again, half to himself. "I wish that my dear ones had a resting place like that. In the crowded city cemetery, the ground is always shaken by the trampling of funeral processions." He buried his face in his hands. For some time, the stranger sat thus, while his host spoke no word. Then, lifting his head, the man looked away over the ridges, just touched with the lingering light, and the valley below wrapped in the shadowy mist. "I came away from it because they said I must, and because I was hungry for this." He waved his hand towards the glowing sky and the forest-clad hills. "This is good for me. It somehow helps me to know how big God is. One could find peace here. Surely, sir, one could find it here, peace and strength." The mountaineer puffed hard at his pipe for a while, then said gruffly, "Seems that way, mister, to them that don't know. But many the time I've wished for God I had never seen these here Ozarks. I used to feel like you do, but I can't no more. They mind me now of him that blackened my life. He used to take on powerful about the beauty of the country, and all the time he was a-turning it into a hell for them that had to stay here after he was gone." As he spoke, anger and hatred grew dark in the giant's face, and the stranger saw the big hands clenched and the huge frame grow tense with passion. Then, as if striving to be not ungracious, the woodman said in a somewhat softer tone, "Can't see much of it this evening, though, 'count of the mist. It'll fair up by the morning, I reckon. You can see a long way from here of a clear day, mister." "Yes, indeed," replied Mr. Howitt in an odd tone. "One could see far from here, I am sure. We who live in the city see but a little further than across the street. We spent our days looking at the work of our own and our neighbors' hands. Small wonder our lives have so little of God in them when we come in touch with so little that God has made." "You live in the city, then, when you are at home?" asked Mr. Matthews, looking curiously at his guest. "I did, when I had a home. I cannot say that I live anywhere now." Old Matt leaned forward in his chair as if to speak again, then paused. Someone was coming up the hill, and soon they distinguished the stalwart form of the son. Sammy, coming from the house with an empty bucket, met the young man at the gate, and the two went towards the spring together. In the silence, the men on the porch watched the moon as she slowly pushed her way up through the leafy screen in the mountain wall. Higher and higher she climbed until her rays fell into the valley below, and the drifting mist from ridge to ridge became a sea of ghostly light. It was a weird scene, almost supernatural in its beauty. Then, from down at the spring, a young girl's laugh rose clearly, and the big mountaineer said in a low tone, "Mr. Howitt, you've got education. It's easy to see that. I've always wanted to ask somebody like you, do you believe in haunts? Do you reckon folks ever come back once they're dead and gone?" The man from the city saw that his big host was terribly in earnest and answered quietly, "No, I do not believe in such things, Mr. Matthews. But if it should be true, I do not see why we should fear the dead." The other shook his head. "I don't know. I don't know, sir. I always said I don't believe, but some things is mighty queer." He seemed to be shaping his thought for further speech, when again the girl's laugh rang clear along the mountainside. The young people were returning from the spring. The mountaineer relighted his pipe, while young Matt and Sammy seated themselves on the step, and Mrs. Matthews, coming from the house, joined the group. "We've just naturally got to find somebody to stay with them sheep, Dad," said the son. "There ain't nobody there tonight, and as near as I can make out, there's 3 ewes and their lambs missing. There ain't a bit of use in us trying to depend on Pete. I'll ride over to Buck Creek tomorrow and see if I can get that fellow Buck told us about," returned the father. "You find it hard to get help on the ranch?" inquired the stranger. "Yes, sir, we do," answered old Matt. "We had a good enough man till about a month ago. Since then, we've been getting along with the best we could. But with some staying out on the range and not coming in, and the wolves getting into the corral at night, we'll lose mightily nigh all the profits this year. The worst of it is, there ain't much to show to get a man, unless that one over on Bear Creek will come. I reckon, though, he'll be like the rest." He sat there, staring gloomily into the night. "Is the work so difficult?" "Difficult, no. There ain't nothing to do but tending to the sheep. The man has to stay at the ranch of nights, though." Mr. Howitt was wondering what staying at the ranch nights could have to do with the difficulty, when, up from the valley below, from out of the darkness in the mist, came a strange sound, a sound as if somebody were singing a song without words. So wild and weird was the melody, so passionate sweet the voice, it seemed impossible that the music should come from human lips. It was more as though some genie of the forest-clad hills wandered through the mist, singing as he went with the joy of his possessions. Mrs. Matthew came close to her husband's side and placed her hand upon his shoulder. As he half arose from his chair, his pipe fallen to the floor. Young Matt rose to his feet and moved closer to the girl, who was also standing. The stranger alone kept his seat and noted the agitation of the others in wonder. For some moments the sound continued, now soft and low, with the sweet sadness of the wind in the pines, then clear and ringing. It echoed and re-echoed along the mountains, now pleading as though a soul in darkness prayed a gleam of light, again rising, swelling exultingly, as in glad triumph, only to die away once more to that moaning wail, seeming at last to lose itself in the mist. Slowly, old Matt sank back into his chair, and the stranger heard him mutter, "Poor boy, poor boy." Aunt Molly was weeping. Suddenly, Sammy sprang from the steps and running down to the walk to the gate sent a clear, piercing call over the valley. "Oh, Pete!" The group on the porch listened intently. Again the girl called, yet again, "Oh, Pete!" But there was no answer. "It's no use, honey," said Miss Matthews, breaking the silence. "It just ain't no use." And the young girl came slowly back to the porch. Chapter 4. A Chat with Aunt Molly. When the stranger looked from his window the next morning, the valley was still wrapped in its gray blanket. But when he and his host came from the house after breakfast, the sun had climbed well above the ridge, and save a long, loosely twisted rope of fog that hung above the distant river, the mists were gone. The city man exclaimed with delight at the beauty of the scene. As they stood watching the sheep, white specks in the distance, climbing out of the valley where the long shadows still lay, to the higher, sunlit pastures, Mr. Matthews said, "We've all been talking about you this morning, Mr. Howitt, and we'd like mightily well to have you stop with us for a spell. If I understood right, you're just out here for your health anyways, and you'll go a long ways, sir, before you'll find a healthier place than this right here. We ain't got much, as such as you're used to, I know, but what we have is yourn, and we'd be proud to have you make yourself the home for us as long as you'd like to stay. You see, it's been a good while since we've met up with anyone like you. We count it a real favor to have you." Mr. Howard accepted the invitation with evident pleasure, and soon after, the mountaineer rode away to Bear Creek on his quest for a man to herd sheep. Young Matt had already gone with his team to the field on the hillside west of the house, and the brown pony stood at the gate ready for Sammy Lane to return to her home on Dewey Bald. "I'd like the best in the world to stay, Aunt Molly," she said, in an answer to Mrs. Matthews' protest. "But you know there is no one to feed the stock, and besides, Mandy Ford will be back sometime today." The older woman's arms was around the girl as they went down the walk. "You must come over real often now, honey. You know it won't be long till you'll be a-leaving for us for good. How do you reckon you'll like being a fine lady and living in the city with all them big folks?" The girl's face flushed, and her eyes had that wide, questioning look as she answered slowly, "I don't know, Aunt Molly. I ain't never seen a sure enough fine lady. I reckon them city folks are a heap different from us, but I reckon they're just as human. It would be nice to have lots of money and purties, but somehow I feel like there's a heap more than that to think about. Anyhow," she added brightly, "I ain't going for quite a spell yet. And you know what Preachin' Bill says, there ain't no use in worrying about the chopping till the dogs has tread the coon. I'll sure come over every day." Mrs. Matthews kissed the girl, and then, standing at the gate, watched until Pony and the rider had disappeared in the forest. Later, Aunt Molly, with the woman's fondness for quite a chat, brought the potatoes as she was preparing for dinner to sit with Mr. Howitt on the porch. "I declare, I don't know what we'll do without Sammy," she said. "I just can't bear to think of her going away." The guest, feeling that some sort of reply was expected, asked, "Is the family moving from the neighborhood?" "No, sir. There ain't no family to move. Just Sammy and her pa, and Jim Blaine won't never leave this country again. You see, Ollie Stewart's uncle, his brother it is, ain't got no children of his own. And he wrote for Ollie to come live with him in the city. He used to go to school and learn the business, foundry and machine shops or something that it is, and if the boy does what's right, he'll get it all someday. Ollie and Sammy have promised ever since to talk first about his going, but they'll wait now until he gets through his schooling. It'll be mighty nice for Sammy, marrying Ollie, but we'll miss her awful. The whole country will miss her, too. She is just the life in the neighborhood, and everyone knows there'll never be another girl like her. Poor child, she ain't had no mother since she was a little trick. She has always come to me for everything, like us being such close neighbors and all. But law, sir, I ain't blaming her a mite for going. With her daddy running with that ornery Wash Gibbs the way he does." Again, the man felt called upon to express his interest. "Is Mr. Lane in the business with this man, Gibbs?" "Ah, no. That is, don't anybody know about any business. I reckon it's all account of those old bald knobbers. They used to hold their meetings up on top of Dewey yonder, and folks do say a man was burned there once because he told some of their secrets. Well, Jim and Wash's daddy and Wash all belonged, though Wash himself wasn't much more than a boy then. And when the government broke up the gang, old man Gibbs was killed, and Jim went to Texas. It was there that Sammy's ma died. When Jim come back, it wasn't long before he was mighty thick again with Wash and his crowd down on the river, and he's been that way ever since. There's them that says it's the same old gang, what's left of 'em, and some thinks too that Jim and Wash know about the old Dewey mine. Mr. Howitt, remembering his conversation with Jed Holland, asked encouragingly, "Is this mine a very rich one?" "Don't nobody rightly know about that, sir," answered Aunt Molly. "This is how it was. Way back when the Injuns was making trouble 'cause the government was moving them out west to the territory, this old man Dewey lived up there somewhere on that mountain. He was a mighty queer old fellow. Didn't mix well with the settlers at all, except Uncle Josh Hindley's boy, who wasn't right smart, and didn't nobody know where he come from nor nothing. But all the same, 'twas him that warned the settlers of the trouble, and helped them all through it, scouting and such. One time, when they were all out of bullets and didn't have nothing to make more out of, Colonel Dewey took a couple of men up and some mules up on that mountain yonder at night, and when they got back, they were just loaded down with lead. But he couldn't tell nobody where he got it, and as long as he was with them, the men didn't dare tell. Well, sir, them 2 men was killed soon after by the Injuns, and soon after the trouble was finally over, Dewey disappeared, and ain't nothing's been heard of since. They say the mine is somewhere in a big cave, but nobody's never found it. Though there was some of them that says the bald knobbers used the cave to hide their stuff in it, and that's how Jim Lane and Wash Gibbs know where it is, and it's all mighty queer. You can see for yourself that Lost Creek down yonder just stinks clean of sight all at once. There must be a big hole in there somewhere." Aunt Molly pointed with her knife to a little stream that winds like a thread of light down into the hollow. "I tell you, sir, these hills is pretty to look at, but there ain't much here for a girl like Sammy. And I don't blame her a mite for wanting to leave. It's a mighty hard place to live, Mr. Howitt. It's dangerous, too, sometimes." "The city has its hardships and dangers, too, Miss Matthews. Life there demands almost too much at times. I often wonder if it is worth the struggle." "I guess that's so," replied Aunt Molly, "but it doesn't seem like it could be hard as it is here. I tell Mr. Matthews we've clean forgot the ways of civilized folks. Altogether, though, I suppose we've done as well as most, and we haven't ought to complain." The old scholar looked at the sturdy figure in its plain calico dress, and at the worn heads busy with the homely task, and the patient, kindly face across which time had plowed many a furrow, in which to plant the seeds of character and worth. He thought of other women who had sat with him on hotel verandas at fashionable watering places, women gowned in silks and laces, women whose soft hands knew no heavier task than the flimsy fancy work they toyed with, and whose greatest care, seemingly, was that time should leave upon their faces no record of the passing years. "And this is the stuff," he said to himself, "that makes possible the civilization that produces them." Aloud, he said, "Do you ever talk of going back to your old home?" "No, sir, not now." She rested her wet hands idly on the edge of the pan of potatoes and turned her face towards the clump of pines. "We used to think we'd go back sometime. Seemed like at first I couldn't stand it. Then the children come, and every time we laid one of 'em over there, I thought about less of leaving. Until now we never talk about it no more. Then there was our girl, too, Mr. Howitt. No, sir, we won't never leave these hills now." "Oh, you had a daughter, too. I understood from Mr. Matthews that your children were all boys." Aunt Molly worked for a few moments longer in silence, then arose and turned towards the house. "Yes, sir, there was a girl. She's buried there under that biggest pine you'll see off there a little to one side. We don't never talk about her. Mr. Matthews can't stand it. Seems like he ain't never been the same since it happened. 'Tain't natural for him to be so rough and short. He's just as good and kind inside as any other man was or ever could be. He's real taken with you, Mr. Howitt, and I'm mighty glad you're gonna stop for a spell. With him, it will do him good. If it hadn't been for Sammy Lane running in every day or two, I don't guess he could have stood it at all." I sure don't know what we'll do now that she's going away. Then there's that at the ranch in Mutton Hollow. But I guess I better not try to tell you about that. I wish Mr. Matthews would, though. Maybe he will. You know so much more than us. I know most you could help or tell us about things. Chapter 5. Just Nobody. After the midday meal, while walking about the place, Mr. Howitt found a well-worn path. It led him to a group of pines not far from the house, where 5 rough headstones marked the 5 mounds placed side by side. A little apart from these was another mound, alone. Beneath the pines the needles made a carpet, firm and smooth, figured by the wild woodbine that clambered over the graves. Moss had gathered on the headstones, and the wind in the dark branches above moaned ceaselessly. About the little plot of ground was a rustic fence of poles was built, and the path led to a stile by which one might enter the enclosure. The stranger seated himself on the rude steps. Below and far away he saw the low hills, rolling ridge on ridge like the seas of a great sea, until the blue distance that they were so lost in the sky that he could not say which was mountain and which was cloud. His poet heart was stirred at the sight of the vast reaches of the forest, all shifting light and shadows. Cool depths of the nearby woods with the sunlight filtering through the leafy arches and streaks and patches of gold and green, and the wide sky with fleets of the clouds sailing to unseen ports below the hills. The man sat very still, and as he looked, the worn face changed. Once, as if some pleasing memory, he smiled. A gray squirrel with bright eyes full of curious regard peeped over the limb of an oak. A redbird, hopping from bush to bush, whistled to his mate, and a bob-white quick call came from a nearby thicket. The dreamer was aroused at last by the musical tingle of a bell. He turned his face towards the sound, but could see nothing. The bell was coming nearer. It came nearer still. Then he saw here and there through the trees small, moving patches of white. An old ewe, followed by 2 lambs, came from behind a clump of bushes, and the moving patches of white shaped themselves into other sheep feeding in the timber. Mr. Howitt sat quite still, and while the old ewe paused to look at him, the lambs took advantage of the opportunity until their mother was satisfied with her inspection, and by moving on, upset them. Soon the whole flock surrounded him, and, after the first lingering look of inquiry, paid no heed to his presence. Then, somewhere along the trees came the quick, low bark of a dog. The man looked carefully in every direction. He could see nothing but the sheep, yet he felt himself observed. Again came the short bark, and this time a girl's voice, Mr. Howitt thought, said, "It's all right, Brave. Go on, brother." And from behind a big rock not far away from a shepherd dog appeared, followed by a youth of some 15 years. He was a lightly built boy, a bit tall for his age perhaps, but perfectly erect, and his every movement was one of indescribable grace, while he managed somehow to wear his rough backwoods garments with an air of distinct as remarkable as it was charming. The face was finely molded, almost girlish, with the very large gray eyes and its frame of yellow golden hair. It was a sad face when in repose, yet wonderfully responsive to every passing thought and mood. But the eyes, with their strange expression and shifting light, proclaimed the lad's mental condition. As the boy came forward in a shy, hesitating way, an expression of amazement and wonder crept into the stranger's face. He left his seat and started forward. "Howard," he said. "Howard." "That ain't his name, mister. His name is Pete," returned the youth in the low, soft tones. In the voice and manner of the lad, no less than his face and eyes, Mr. Howitt read his story. Unconsciously, he echoed the words of Mr. Matthews. Poor Pete. The dog lifted his head and looked into the man's face, while his tail wagged a joyful greeting. And as the man stooped to pat the animal and speak a few kind words, a beautiful smile broke across the delicate features of the youth. Throwing himself on the ground, he cried, "Come here, Brave!" And taking the dog's face between his hands and in confidential tones, ignoring Mr. Howard's presence, "He's a good man, ain't he, brother?" The dog answered with wagging tail, "We sure like him, don't we?" The dog gave a low bark. "Listen, Brave, listen." He lifted his face to the treetops and turned his ear to the ground, while the dog too seemed to hearken. Again that strange smile illuminated his face. Yes, Brave, we sure like him. And the tree things like him too, brother. And the flowers, the little flower things that know everything, they're all singing to Pete because he's come. Do you see the flower things in his ear and hear the tree things talking in his voice, Brave? And see, brother, the sheep like him too." Pointing towards the stranger, he laughed aloud. The old Ute had come quite close to the man, and one of the lambs was nibbling at his trousers leg. Mr. Howard seated himself on the stile again, and the dog, released by the youth, came to lie down at his feet, while the boy seemed to forget his companions and appeared to be listening to the voices unheard by them, now and then nodding his head and moving his lips in answer. The old man looked long and thoughtful at the youth, his own face revealing a troubled mind. This then was Pete. Poor Pete. "Howard," whispered the man, "the perfect image." And then he said again, half aloud, "Howard." The boy turned his face and smiled. "That ain't his name, mister. His name's Pete. Pete seen you yesterday over at Dewey, and Pete heard the big hills and the woods a-singing when you talked. But Jed, he didn't hear. Jed, he don't hear nothing but himself. He can't. But Pete, he heard all of Pete's people, too, and the gray mist things that come out and dance along the mountain, 'cause they were glad you come. And Pete went with you along the old trail. Of course, though, you don't know. Do you like Pete's people, mister?" He waved his hands to include the forest, the mountains, and the sky, and there was a note of anxiety in the sweet voice as he asked again, "Do you like Pete's friends?" "Yes, indeed, I like your friends," replied Mr. Howard heartily, "and I would like to be your friend too, if you will let me. What is your other name?" The boy shook his head. Not me, he said. "Do you like Pete?" The man was puzzled. "Are you not Pete?" he asked. The delicate face grew sad. No, he said in a low, moaning tone. "I'm not Pete. Pete, he lives in here." He touched himself on the breast. I am. A look of hopeless bewilderment crept into his eyes. "I don't know who I am. I just nobody. Nobody can have no name, can he?" He stood with a downcast head. Then suddenly he raised his face and the shadows lifted as he said, "Pete knows, mister. Ask Pete." A sudden thought came to Mr. Howard. "Who is your father, my boy?" Instantly the brightness vanished. Again the words were a puzzled moan. "I ain't got no father, mister. I ain't me. Nobody can have no father, can he?" The other spoke quietly. But Pete had a father. Who was Pete's father? Instantly the gloom was gone and the face was bright again. "Sure, mister, Pete's got a father. Don't you know? Everyone knows that. Look." He pointed upward to a break in the trees, to a large cumulus cloud that had assumed a fantastic shape. "He lives in them white hills up there. See him, mister. Sometimes he takes Pete with him up to the sky, and of course I go along. We sail and sail and sail in the big bird things up there while the sky sings, and sometimes we play with the cloud things. All day long in them white hills. Pete says he'll take me away up there where the star things live someday, and we won't never come back again, and I won't be nobody no more. And Aunt Molly, when she says reckon Pete knows, of course, I'd hate mighty much to go away from Uncle Matt and Aunt Molly and Matt and Sammy, 'cause they've been mighty good to me. But I just gotta go where Pete goes, you see, 'cause I ain't nobody, and nobody can't be nothing, can he?" The stranger was fascinated by the wonderful charm of the boy's manner and words. as the lad's sensitive face glowed or was clouded by each wayward thought, and the music of his sweet voice rose and fell, Mr. Howitt told himself one might easily fancy the child some wandering spirit of the woods and hills. Aloud he asked, "Has Pete a mother too?" The youth nodded towards the big pine that grew to one side of the group, and, lowering his voice, replied, "That's Pete's mother." Mr. Howard pointed to the grave. "You mean she sleeps there?" No, not there. There." He pointed up to a big tree itself. "She never sleeps, don't you hear her?" He paused. The wind moaned through the branches of the pine. Drawing nearer to the stranger's side, the boy whispered, "She always talks that way, always. It makes Pete feel bad. She wants somebody. Hear her calling? Callin'. He'll soon come here someday, mister. He sure will. Say, do you know where he is?" The man, startled, drew back. No, my boy, certainly not. What do you mean? Who are you?" Like the moaning of the pines came the reply. "Nothin', mister. Nobody can mean nothin', can they? I'm jest nobody. But Pete lives in here. Ask Pete." "Is Pete watching the sheep?" asked Mr. Howitt, anxious to divert the boy's mind to other channels. "Yes, we're attending them now. They can't trust us, you know. When they call Pete, he just goes, and of course I've got to go along." "Who is it that calls Pete?" "Why, they, don't you know?" "I lowered you know about things. They called Pete last night. The moonlight things was out, and all the shadow things. Didn't you see them, mister? The moonlight things, the wind, the stars, the shadow things, and all the rest played with Pete in the shining mist. And of course I was along. Didn't you hear him singing? Pete, he always sings that away when the moonlight things is out. Seems like he just can't help it." "But what happens to the sheep when Pete goes away?" Boy shook his head sadly. "Sometimes they get so lost that young Matt can't ever find 'em. Sometimes wolves get 'em. It's too bad, mister, it sure is." Then laughing aloud, he clapped his hands. "There was a feller at the ranch to keep 'em, but he didn't stay. Ho, he didn't stay. You bet he didn't. Pete didn't like 'em. Brave didn't like 'em. Nothing didn't like 'em. The trees wouldn't talk when he was around. The flowers died when he looked at 'em, and the birds all stopped singing when he went over the mountains. He didn't stay, though." Again he laughed. "You bet he didn't stay. Pete knows." "Why did the man go?" asked Mr. Howitt, thinking to solve a part of the mystery at least. But the only answer he could draw from the boy was, "Pete knows. Pete knows." Later, when the stranger returned to the house, Pete went with him. At the gate they met Mr. Matthews, returning unsuccessful from his trip. "Hello, boy," said the big man. "How's Pete today?" The lad went with his glad face to the giant mountaineer. It was clear that the two were the warmest friends. "Pete's mighty glad today, 'cause he's come." He pointed to Mr. Howitt. "Does Pete like him?" Boy nodded. "All Pete's people like him. Ask him to keep the sheep, Uncle Matt. He won't be scared at the shadow things in the night." Mr. Matthews smiled as he turned to his guest. "Pete never makes a mistake in his judgment of men, Mr. Howitt. He's different from us ordinary folks, as you can see, but in some things he knows a heap more. I'm mighty glad he took up with you, sir. All day I've been thinking I'd tell you about some things I don't like to talk about. I feel after last night you would understand, maybe, and might help me. You having education, but still I think I'm a little afraid of us being such strangers. I know I'm right now, 'cause Pete says so. If you weren't the kind of man I think you are, he never took to you like he has." That night, the mountaineer told the stranger from the city the story that I have put down in the next chapter. Chapter 6. The Story. Slowly, the big mountaineer filled his cob pipe of strong, homegrown tobacco, watching his guest keenly the while from under heavy brows. Behind the dark pines, the sky was blood red, and below, Mutton Hollow was fast being lost in the gathering gloom. When his pipe was lighted, old Matt said, "Well, sir, I reckon you think some things you've seen and heard since you came last night are mighty queer. I ain't saying neither, but what you got reasons for thinking so?" Mr. Howitt made no reply, and after puffing a few moments in silence, the other continued. "If it weren't for what you said last night making me feel like I wanted to talk to you, and Pete taking up with you the way he has, I wouldn't be telling you what I'm going to now. There's some trails, Mr. Howitt, that ain't pleased to go back over. I didn't know to ever go over this one again. Did you and Pete talk much this afternoon?" In a few words, Mr. Howitt told of his meeting with the strange boy and their conversation. When he had finished, the big man smoked in silence. It was as if he found it hard to begin. From a tree on the mountainside below, a screech owl sent up his long, quivering call. A bat darted past in the dusk, and away over on Compton Ridge a hound bayed. The mountaineer spoke. "That's Sam Wilson's dog. Ranger must be starting to fox." The sound died away in the distance. Old Matt began his story. "Our folks all live back in Illinois. If I do say so, they are as good a stock as you'll ever find anywhere. But there was a lot of us, and I always had a notion to settle in a new country where there was more room, like the land wasn't so dear. So when wife and I was married, we come out here. I recollect we camped below Jim Lane's cabin on yon side of Old Dewey there. That was before Jim was married, and a wild young buck he was too, as you ever see. Next day, wife and I rode along the trail till we stuck up this gap, and we've been here ever since. We've had our ups and downs like most folks, sir, and sometimes it looked like they were mostly downs, but we got along. And last fall, I bought in the ranch down there in the hollow. The boy was just 18, and we thought then that he'd be making his home there some day. I didn't know how that would be now, but there was another reason too why we wanted the place. You'll see when I get to it. There was 5 other boys, as I told you last night. The oldest 2 would have been men now. The girl," his voice broke, "the girl came third. She was 20 when we buried her over there. That was 15 year ago come the middle of next month. Everybody lowed that she was a mighty pretty baby, and, being the only girl, I reckon we made her more than we did the boys. She growed up into a mighty fine young woman, too, strong and full of fire and go, like Sammy Lane. Seems the wife and me, when Sammy's around, that it's her own girl come back again. We've always hoped that she and Grant would take the ranch down yonder. I reckon that's all over now that Ollie Stewart has come into such fine thing in the city. Anyway, ain't got nothing to do with that, I'm a-telling you. She didn't seem to care about nothing at all for none of the neighbors' boys like most girls do. She'd go with them and have a good time then, all right, but that was it. Appeared like she'd rather be with her brothers or her mother or me. Well, one day, when we was out on the range a-riding for stock, she'd go with me that way. We met a stranger over there at the deer lick in the big, low gap, coming along the old mountain trail. He was a fine-looking a man as you'd ever see, sir, big and grand-like, with lightish hair kind of wavy and a big mustache like his hair, and fine white teeth showing when he smiled. He was sure good-looking, damn him. With his fine store clothes and a smooth, easy way of talking and acting he had, 'tain't no wonder she took up with him. We all did. I used to think God never made a finer body for a man. I now know that hell don't hold a meaner heart than the one in that same fine body. That's something that bothers me a heap, Mr. Howitt. As I say, our girl was built like Sammy Lane, and so far as looks she was his dead match. I used to wonder when I'd look at them together if there was ever such another fine-looking pair. I ain't gonna tell you his name, there ain't no call to, as I can see. It might be some decent man named the same, but he was one of these here artist fellows had come into the hills to paint, he said. A smothered exclamation burst from the listener. Mr. Matthew, not noticing, continued. He sure did make a lot of pictures, as they seemed mighty nice to us, though of course we didn't know nothing about such things. There was one big one he made of Maggie that was natural as life, was as always drawing of her in one way or another, and had a lot of little pictures that didn't amount to much, and that he never did finish. But this big one he worked on off and on all summer. It was sure fine, with her a-standing by the ranch spring holding out a cup of water and smiling like she was offering you a drink. It was well that night had fallen. At old Matt's word, the stranger shrank back in his chair, his hand raised as if to ward off a deadly blow. He made a sound in his throat as if he would cry out, but could not from horror or fear. But the darkness hid his face, and the mountaineer, with mind intent upon his story, did not heed. He took an old cabin at the foot of the hill near where the sheep corral is now, and fixed it up to work in. The shack had been built first by old man Dewey, him on that mountain named after. It was down there he painted the big picture of her standing by a big spring. He never thought nothing about her being with him so much. Though we ought to have knowed better. We ought to have knowed better. The old giant paused for some time, sat with his head bowed, his forgotten pipe on the floor. Well, he began again. He stopped with us all that summer, and then one day he went out as usual and didn't come back. We hunted the hills out for signs, thinking maybe he had met up with some trouble. He had sent all of his pictures away the week before. Jim Lane hauled them to the nearest settlement for him. The girl was nigh about wild and rode with me all during the hunt. And once, when we saw some buzzards circling, she gave a little cry and turned so white that I suspicioned maybe she got to thinking more of him than we knew. And one afternoon, when we were down yonder in the hollow, she says, all of a sudden like, Daddy, it ain't no use a riding no more. He ain't made up with no trouble. He's left all the trouble with us. She looked so peaked, and her eyes were so big and staring that it never come over me in a flash what she meant. She saw in a minute that I sensed it and just hung her head, and we come home. She just kept getting worse and worse, Mr. Howitt. 'Peared to fade away like I watched them big glade lilies do when the hot weather comes. About the only time she would show any life at all is when someone would go for the mail, when she would always be at the gate a-waiting for us. Then one day a letter come. I brung it myself. She would give a little cry when I handed it to her and run into the house most like her old self. I went out to the barn to put up my horse, thinking maybe it was going to be all right after all. But pretty soon I heard a scream and then a laugh. For God, sir, that laugh's a ringing in my ears still. She was raving mad when I got to her, a-laughing and screeching and trying to hurt herself, all the while calling for him to come. I read the letter afterwards. It told over and over how he loved her, and how no woman could ever be to him what she was. She said they were made for each other and all that, and then it went on to say how he could never see her again, and told about what a grand old family his was, and how his father was so proud and expected great things from him, that he didn't dare tell, them being the last of his here old family, and her being a backwoods girl without any schooling or nothing. My God, oh my God, faltered the stranger's voice into the darkness. Old Matt talked in a hard, easy tone. Of course, it was all rode out nice and smooth like how he talked, but that's just the sense of it. He finished it by saying that he would be on his way to the old country when the letter reached her, that it would be of no use trying to find him. The girl quieted down after a spell, but her mind never come back. She wasn't just to say plumb crazy, but she seemed kind of dazed and lost like, and wouldn't take no notice of nobody. Acted all the time like she was expecting him to come. And she'd stand out there by the gate for hours at a time, watching the old trail and talking low to herself. Pete is her boy, Mr. Howitt. As you have seen, he ain't just right. Just like he was marked by some way in his mind like you've seen other folks marked in their bodies. We have done our best by the boy, sir, but I don't guess he'll ever be any better. Once for a spell we tried keeping him to home, but he got right sick and would have died for sure if I wouldn't let him go. It was pitiful to see him. Everyone knows there's nothing in the woods hurt him nohow, so we let him come and go as he likes. He just stops with the neighbors whenever he happens in. Folks are all as good to him as they can be, 'cause everybody knows how it is. You see, sir, people here don't think nothing of a woods cult nohow, but we was raised different. His wife says we've most forgot civilized ways, but of course there's some things that a man's been raised right can never forget. She died when Pete was born, and the last thing she said was, "He'll come, Daddy. He'll sure come." Pete says the wind singing is the big pine over there is her calling for him yet. Mighty queer how the boy got that notion. But you see, that's the way with him. And that ain't all, sir. The big man moved his chair nearer the other and lowered his voice to a hoarse whisper. Folks say she's come back. That there them swears they've seen her round the old cabin where they used to meet up where he painted her picture, the big one, you know. Just before I bought the ranch, it was first, and that's why we can't get no one to stay with the sheep. I don't know, Mr. Howitt, I don't know. I've thought a heap about it. I ain't never seen it myself, and it 'pears to me that if she could come back at all, she'd sure come to her old daddy. And again, I figure that it being took the way she was, part of her dead, so to speak, from the time she got that letter, her mind was so set on his coming back that maybe somehow, you see, that maybe she's a sort of waiting for him there. Maybe the time I have prayed all night that God would come and let me meet him just once more, or that proud father of his just once, sir, I'd go to hell if I could only meet them first. If she is waiting for him down here, he'll come. He'll sure come. Hell couldn't hold him against such as that, and when he comes, unconsciously, as he spoke the last sentences, the giant's voice took a tone of terrible meaning, and he slowly rose from his seat. When he uttered the last words, he was standing erect, his muscles tensed, his powerful frame shaken with passion. There was an inarticulate cry of horror as the mountaineer's guest startled to his feet. A moment he stood, then sank back into his chair, a cowering, shivering heap. Long into the night, the stranger walked the floor of his little room under the roof, his face drawn and white, whispering half-aloud things that would have startled his unexpecting host. My boy, mine, to do such a thing as that. Howard, oh Christ, I should live to be glad that you are dead. That picture, his masterpiece, the picture that made his fame, the picture he would never part with, that we could never find. I see it all now. Just God, what a thing to carry in one's soul. Once he paused to stand at the window, looking down upon the valley. The moon had climbed high above the mountain, but beneath the floor of silver light the shadows lay dark and deep in Mutton Hollow. Then, as he stood there, from the shadowy gloom came the wild, weird song that they had heard the evening before. The man at the window groaned. The song sank to a low, moaning wail. He seemed to hear again the wind in the pine above the grave of the murdered girl. She was calling. Would he come back? Back from the grave. Would he come? Words of the giant mountaineer seemed burned into the father's brain. Hell couldn't hold him against such as that. Then the man with the proud face of a scholar and a poet, drew back from the window. shaking with the fear he could not control. He crept into the corner and crouched upon the floor. With wide eyes, he stared into the dark. He prayed. And this is how it came about that the stranger, who followed the old trail along the higher unlit ground, followed also the other trail down into the valley where the gloomy shadows are, there to live at the ranch near the haunted cabin, the shepherd of Mutton Hollow.